People say that in the Wild West, the land remembers. It remembers every footstep, every wagon wheel rut, every drop of sweat, and every drop of blood that falls. And there is one valley in the Red Rock region of Texas, where rumor has it that the rocks there are bright red, not because of the sun, but because 3 generations of hatred have seeped into the earth. This is the story of 2 people who should not have met. 2 names that should not stand next to each other, and one love that the entire Wild West once believed could not exist. Sit down, pour yourself one warm glass of something, and let me tell you about the wild rose of the far west. The Texas sun poured down on the Red Rock region one kind of sunlight that could melt a person's very soul. It was one unforgiving sun. It licked across the sandstone slabs, heating them so intensely that even at night the heat still radiated from them like one coal furnace. The dust rolled up into faint ribbons of smoke, hovering over the ground before vanishing into the air. And in the distance, the mountains stood silently like bronze giants sleeping 1,000-year sleep, ignoring the worldly affairs below. Caleb Miller tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes narrowing beneath his turned-down hat brim. He was one true cowboy of this land, broad-shouldered, sun-tanned, with hands calloused from ropes and gun grips. 26 years old, yet his eyes already bore the weariness of someone who had lived too long on guard. His cattle herd had lost 3 cows into the Boundary Canyon, the territory where the Miller family would never be foolish enough to set foot. His father had warned him, his grandfather had warned him, and even those lying under 3 inches of dirt had warned him. Never cross the boundary. On the other side was the enemy's land. But 3 cows were 3 cows, and this season, losing them meant losing one part of their livelihood. Caleb spurred his horse along the cliff edge, feeling both frustrated and vigilant. Before he could think much about it, one neigh tore through the space, wild, ear-piercing, and full of panic. That neigh was not from one animal at rest. It was the cry of one creature facing death. He yanked the reins and dashed forward. The horse's hooves pounded on the rocky ground, kicking up one blind cloud of dust behind them. Caleb rushed past one narrow bend, and then he saw it. In the clearing between 2 sheer cliffs, one chestnut mare was rearing up frantically. Its 2 front hooves slashed at the air, its mane tossing like one flame. Beneath its feet, coiled on the hot sand, one rattlesnake was shaking its tail with one rattling sound. One dry noise that anyone living in the West understood as one death knell. And on the back of that untamed horse, one girl was holding on tightly. Her hair flew wildly in the wind. One of her hands gripped the saddle so tightly her knuckles turned white, while the other hand was reaching for the gun tucked at her hip. She did not scream at all. On her face was not the fear of someone surrendering, but the cold concentration of one person, calculating how to survive. But the horse was too panicked, and if it only threw her to the ground, the rattlesnake would end everything in just one heartbeat. Caleb had no time to think. His hands acted before his brain even could. The rope left his hands, tracing one neat arc in the sunlight, as beautiful as one stroke from one skilled craftsman's pen, and then tightened around the horse's neck. He pulled back, the veins in his arms bulging, his boots digging deep into the sand, his whole body leaning backward to maintain balance. The horse stumbled, let out one final neigh, and then collapsed to its knees, and the girl was thrown from the saddle. He dropped the rope and lunged forward. She fell into his arms, as light and sudden as one gust of wind slipping through one mountain crevice. For one moment the entire canyon fell silent. The rattlesnake, perhaps terrified enough by the chaotic scene, quietly slithered away among the rocks. The horse stood up, trembling, and then bowed its head to graze as if nothing had ever happened. Only 2 people remained, one gasping for breath in the other's arms, and the bright red sunlight draped over them both like one silk veil. The girl looked up at him, and for the first time, Caleb saw those eyes clearly, sharp as one blade, black as the desert night, yet holding one hidden warmth behind them. "Thank you, stranger," she said, and then stood up on her own, dusting off her worn-out denim skirt. She did it in one decisive manner, neither acting coy nor weak. "If it were not for you..." I probably would have become food for the vultures by now. She looked up with one smile, and that smile, for some unknown reason, caused the iron-willed cowboy's chest to involuntarily skip one beat. This borderland is very dangerous, Caleb said, bending down to pick up his hat to hide the embarrassment rising in his heart. You should not travel alone. What about you? She tilted her head. You are also traveling alone. He could not answer. He just dusted off the brim of his hat and then reached out his hand. My name is Cal. He swallowed his last name inside. It was one cautious habit of those carrying too many enemies, never speaking their full name to strangers, because in this West, one last name could be one death sentence. And I am Elle, she replied, taking his hand. And Caleb completely did not know that in that very moment, the girl had also just done the exact same thing he had done. She had also just hidden her last name. Her real name was Elena. She was not like any of the aristocratic young ladies in town who only knew how to fan themselves and feared mud stains on their skirt hems. Her hands knew how to hold the reins and how to load one gun, and later he would learn that her marksmanship was not inferior to any man in the West, perhaps even better. They parted ways by the canyon that day, each heading in one direction, but they both looked back, and they both knew that they would see each other again. That summer, the desolate canyon became one private world for the two of them. They did not make plans with words. It was just that the next day, Caleb would find one excuse to look for stray cattle toward the border again, and Elena, for some unknown reason, had errands to run on horseback in that exact direction. They met seemingly by coincidence, then one second time, one third time, and that coincidence became the thing both of them waited for all day long. They met when the sun had leaned to the west, when the heat subsided, and the rock shadows cast long upon the sand like giant fingers. Caleb brought one little dry bread, one piece of salted meat, and one flask of cheap whiskey that he hid in his saddlebag. Elena brought laughter and stories that made him forget that his life originally consisted of only saddles and gun barrels. They built one small fire between the two cliffs, where the light would not leak out for anyone to see. And beside that firelight, two people who had grown up in one state of vigilance gradually learned how to lower their shields. One night, when the desert sky was so thickly packed with stars that it felt as if one could reach out and touch them, Caleb taught her how to read the sky. Do you see that cluster of stars? He pointed up at the night sky. Those 7 stars arranged like one water dipper. People call it the Big Dipper. Elena leaned back, resting against one still warm rock, her eyes following his finger. I see it. But what is it for? Just draw one straight line from the 2 stars at the front of the dipper, Caleb said, his voice deep and slow, as if he were sharing one secret. And you will find the North Star. That star never moves. The whole sky revolves around it, but it stands still in one place all night long, all year long, lost in the middle of the desert, completely disoriented. Yet if you can still see it, there is still one way back home. Elena fell silent for one long time. Then she asked, her voice so soft it almost blended into the crackling sound of the fire. Then if one day you lose me, which star will you use to find me? Caleb turned to look at her. The firelight danced in those sharp eyes, softening them in one strange way. He remained silent for one very long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he replied, his voice deep like the wind slipping through rock crevices. I will not let myself lose you, Elle. That was not one ornate phrase. Caleb was not one man who knew how to speak ornate words. But precisely because of that, those words were as heavy as stone, as real as the earth, and Elena understood that he was telling the truth. For her part, Elena also opened up one world for Caleb that his weather-beaten life had never gifted him. One afternoon, she led him to one barren rock crevice at the end of the canyon. There, sprouting from one crack without even one handful of dirt, were tiny purple wildflowers. They were fragile, trembling in the hot wind, yet still holding on. Do you know what people call this kind of flower? Elena carefully picked one blossom. The flower of the daredevils, because only they dare to bloom in the middle of this dead land. Everything else withers away, but they keep sprouting, year after year, in one place where no one expects there to be life. She stepped closer, and before Caleb could react, she pinned the purple flower onto his hat brim. Even in the most barren places, there is something willing to grow just because it wants to live, she said softly. You see, maybe this West is not entirely filled with death after all. Perhaps amidst all the aridness there is still room for one beautiful thing to be born. Caleb stood still, letting her pin the flower, not daring to move. He looked at her under the blazing red sunset, and for the first time in his life, the cowboy, accustomed to sleeping with one Colt revolver under his pillow, felt strangely at peace in his heart. That kind of peace which he had never known he was missing until he found it. They talked to each other about all sorts of things, about dreams, about places they wanted to go, about one life where one did not always have to look over one's shoulder to see if anyone was chasing them. But there was one thing both of them never talked about: their last names. And they did not bother asking either, because to them, Cal and El were enough. Those two names carried no history, no blood, and no lessons of hatred. Those two names belonged solely to them, in this canyon, under these stars. Their love grew amidst that harsh land, pure, fierce, and as blind as the whirlwinds sweeping up blinding dust. Because neither of them had any idea that the real name the other was hiding was the three-generation blood feud of their own family. Let me tell you about that feud. The Millers and the Vances had fought over water sources and land for 3 generations. Everything started from one stream, the only stream that flowed all year round in this arid land. Caleb's great-grandfather and Elena's great-grandfather, in the past, were once friends. But then one season of drought arrived, the water dried up, and their friendship dried up with it. One bullet was fired. Then that bullet demanded one revenge bullet. And just like that, for 30 years, blood was exchanged for blood, life for life. So much blood had seeped into this valley that rumors said the rocks here were red because of it. And every child from the two families, from the time they could not even read or write, had one single lesson engraved into their very marrow. The person on the other side of the boundary is one enemy. There are no exceptions. There is no forgiveness. Caleb had grown up with that lesson. Elena had as well. Yet now, beneath the stars, they were giving each other their hearts completely unaware. People always say, one needle hidden in one bag for one long time will eventually poke its way out one day. One late summer afternoon, when the sky was dyed so bright red that the entire valley seemed to be on fire, Caleb and Elena stood embracing each other to say goodbye at the familiar boundary. Summer was almost over, and Caleb had come to one decision. "El," he said, placing his 2 hands on her shoulders, "I do not want to hide anymore." She looked up at him. "I am completely sick of having to meet you in secret. I am sick of the fact that every time we part, we do not know whether we will get to see each other again tomorrow." He took one deep breath. "I want to take you away from this place. Go north or go west to one land where no one knows who we are. Where we can start over just as Cal and El. Will you come with me?" Elena's eyes lit up. Her lips parted to answer, but the sound of horse hooves stole her words. From 2 sides of the canyon, 2 groups of people galloped forward at the exact same time. Those were 2 border patrols, one from the Miller family, one from the Vance family, and, by one cruel twist of fate, they clashed right where the 2 lovers were standing. In one split second, Caleb and Elena were trapped between 2 walls of men and horses, guns bristling, and sand blowing blindly. "Elena!" One aged yet powerful voice roared, echoing against the cliffs. One silver-haired man reined in his horse, his sun-tanned face contorted with anger and horror. It was the Vance patriarch, Elena's father. His hand was already placed on his gun grip. "Get away from that Miller bastard! Right this instant!" At the same time, from the other side of the canyon, the head of the Miller family, who was Caleb's own uncle, the man who had raised him since his father fell, shouted loudly, his voice hoarse from horror. "Caleb, you fool! Do you know who you are hugging? That is the daughter of the man who killed your father." The space suddenly froze. Caleb felt Elena's body and his arms turn completely cold, becoming as stiff as one rock. She slowly looked up at him. The sharp, proud eyes from before were now shattered, full of confusion and agony. "Cal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your last name is Miller?" He could not utter one word. His throat choked up, because at that same moment, he also understood everything. The gentle girl who had pinned the purple flower onto his hat, the one who had asked him which star he would use to find her, was none other than Elena Vance, the precious daughter of his sworn enemy, the daughter of the man whom his entire family had cursed for 30 years. That whole beautiful summer, that whole little private world they had built in the canyon, all of it was erected upon one lie that no one had intentionally spoken. Caleb looked into her eyes. He wanted to say many things. He wanted to say that last names changed absolutely nothing, that he loved her no matter what name she bore. But surrounding them were 30 gun barrels, and the air was so thick that one tiny spark could scorch everything to ashes. Click, click, click. Dozens of gun barrels cocked simultaneously. That sound echoed throughout the canyon like the sound of breaking bones, cold and decisive. The men on both sides glared at each other across the narrow distance, their eyes bloodshot with hatred accumulated over 3 generations. If only one finger trembled, if one impatient person pulled the trigger, one massacre would dye this land red one more time. And this time, both Caleb and Elena would be among those who fell. 2 old fathers faced each other across the canyon. Behind each man was one entire family lineage, and right in the middle, trapped between the line of life and death, were their 2 children, tightly holding on to each other's hands. In the moment when the entire valley held its breath, Caleb took one step forward, but not toward his family, rather turning his back on them. He spun around, spread his 2 arms wide, and stood shielding Elena, shielding her from even the guns of his own Miller family. He stood there, empty-handed without one single inch of iron for protection, facing his own flesh and blood. "Enough!" His voice echoed against the cliffs, resonating throughout the canyon like thunder. "Everyone, enough!" Both groups of people froze. "For the past 30 years, Caleb said, his voice shaking with emotion, but every word clear. "The blood of Millers and Vances has spilled onto this land. How many people have died? How many children have grown up fatherless? How many mothers have cried all their tears dry? For what? For one stream, for one boundary line that none of us drew ourselves. It was left by our forefathers, and we just kept killing each other over it." He looked around, from one face to another face. "How much longer do you want us to continue like this? Until there is not one person left alive in this entire valley to hold one grudge." And then, Elena stepped out. She did not cower behind his back. She stepped out of Caleb's protective embrace, stood up straight, held her head high, and turned to face her father. Tears rolled down her dust-smudged cheeks, but her gaze did not waver in the slightest. "Father," her voice broke, yet remained extraordinarily resolute. "I love this man." Mr. Vance flinched, as if he had been slapped by someone. "I have loved him since I did not even know what last name he bore." Elena continued, every word seemingly carved into the space. "I loved him when he was just one stranger who saved my life. And now, when I know that he is one Miller, I still love him. The last name cannot change my heart, Father." She took one more step toward him. "If our family only knows how to resolve everything with guns and bullets, if just because of one last name you are willing to kill the man I love, then please shoot me first. Because I swear, I will never, never point one gun at this man. If you want to kill him, you have to step over my dead body." And then she did one thing that left the entire canyon stunned. She pulled out the gun tucked at her hip. The crowd tensed, one few gun barrels shifting up. But Elena did not raise the gun. She only held it in her hand for one brief moment, looking at it as if looking at one thing belonging to one old person. And then she let it drop onto the sand. The sound of metal hitting rock rang out solitarily in the absolute silence. One small sound. But in that breathless canyon, it echoed like the ringing of one bell. Caleb looked at her, then he slowly reached his hand down to his belt, unbuckled his six-shooter Colt, the gun he had never parted with since he was 15 years old, the gun that had become one part of his body, and he placed it on the sand, right next to Elena's gun. The two guns lay next to each other on the red sand, still, harmless, like two hearts that had finally been laid to rest. Both patriarchs were stunned. They had witnessed countless deaths in their lives. They were accustomed to the smell of gunpowder, to the sound of men falling, to dried blood on the sand. But the sight before their eyes right now, two children with bare hands, ready to trade their very lives to protect each other, was something that this entire Wild West had lost for far too long. It was the courage to love, and the bravery to forgive. One cowboy from the Miller family, the most aggressive guy of the bunch, the one who was always the most eager whenever there was one chance to open fire, was the first person to slowly lower his gun barrel. He looked at the two children, then looked at his gun, as if for the first time in his life, he found it heavy and repulsive. Then came the second person, the third person. Like dominoes falling one after another, every gun barrel was loosened, every arm was lowered. The metallic clatter of guns being holstered again echoed sporadically across the canyon, one completely different sound from the cocking of guns earlier. Mr. Miller slowly looked over at his sworn rival on the other side of the canyon. Two elderly men, their hair completely white from senseless battles, looked at each other across the distance of 3 generations of hatred. In that moment, perhaps both of them were thinking about those who had passed away. Brothers, children, childhood friends who had fallen just because of one stream and one boundary line. Mr. Miller let out one long exhale, as if casting off one burden that had weighed on his shoulders his entire life, and then slowly released his hand from the gun grip. As for Mr. Vance, he quietly watched his precious daughter, the child he loved more than his own life, holding tightly onto the hand of the Miller boy. He looked for one very long time, and for the first time in 30 years he no longer saw one enemy on the other side. He only saw two children in love, loving each other despite everything that his generation had tried to cram into their heads, and he wondered, perhaps for the first time in his life, for the past 30 years, what have we really been fighting for? Peace did not arrive in one afternoon. Do not let anyone tell you that 30 years of hatred can vanish in just one beautiful moment. The truth was much more difficult than that. It took many weeks of fierce negotiation. Many arguments nearly turned back into brawls. For many long nights, the two families sat around the liquor table, arguing back and forth, digging up old wounds and unpaid blood debts. There were those who swore they would rather die than ever sit at the same table with the lot on the other side. There were mothers who had lost children, who still could not look directly into the faces of the opponents. But every time the negotiations seemed to fall apart, people would remember that scene at the canyon that day. Two children laying their guns on the sand, ready to die for each other. And every time that happened, one more person would be willing to lower their voice. Ultimately, the final gunshot that went off in that valley was not one gunshot meant to kill. It was one gunshot fired into the air, shot into the blue sky, kicking off one celebration. Instead of continuing to fight over the water source, the two families found one path that no one from the 3 previous generations had been willing to sit down and think about. The Miller family was allowed to guide their cattle across the Vance land to reach the water source. In exchange, the Vance family would share one portion of the profits from the cattle drives sold to the north, trips in which the Millers inherently had more experience and contacts. It turned out that what so many years of guns and bullets could not resolve was finally settled simply by one frank conversation and one handshake. Both sides grew richer. Both sides lost their fear of having to look over their shoulders every time they went out to the fields. People wondered why they did not do this 30 years ago. And no one had one answer, except for 2 words: hatred. And then, one wedding unprecedented in the history of this land was held. It took place right at the Boundary Canyon, the place that had once been one bloody battlefield, where gunshots and the sound of falling men had once echoed. But on that day, the red sand was completely covered with the purple wildflowers that Elena loved. the flower of the daredevils, the flower that dared to bloom in the dead land. People had picked them from all the rock crevices in the region and scattered them all over the isle. The lively sound of banjos rang out instead of gunshots. Whiskey was poured until the glasses overflowed among people who, just yesterday, still considered each other irreconcilable enemies. At first, the two sides still stood apart on two sides, awkward and suspicious. But then the liquor set in. The music started up, and one reckless Miller guy invited one Vance girl out to dance. The girl hesitated, then accepted. Before long, Millers were dancing with Vances, clumsy and awkward at first, stepping on each other's feet, and then bursting into laughter when they tripped. Those laughs, after 30 years of nothing but crying and gunshots, sounded unfamiliar, yet wonderfully warm. Under the western sunset, still as bright red as that fateful afternoon years ago, but now so gentle, Caleb guided Elena into the dance. Pinned to the brim of his hat was still the purple flower she had gifted him on the day they did not yet know each other's real names. "Do you remember?" Elena whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You once said you would find me using one star." Caleb smiled. He held her hand tightly, the hand that he would now hold for the rest of his life. "Now there is no need for any stars anymore," he replied softly, "because I will never let myself lose you." And they had proven to this entire wild and harsh West one thing that it had forgotten for one very long time. The most powerful weapon in this world is not one hot Colt or one shiny Winchester. It is one heart that dares to love sincerely and dares to forgive bravely. The next dawn rose over the valley. Sunlight cast one golden glow over the red stone slabs, over the stream that now belonged to both families, over the purple flowers remaining from the wedding the day before, and for the first time after 30 long years, not one drop of blood spilled onto that land. People say the land remembers. It remembers blood. It remembers hatred. But as it turned out, it also knows how to remember one other thing. It remembers the day two empty-handed people taught one entire valley how to put down their guns. And that, my friends, is the story of the wild rose of the far West.